This is the BBC.
Dear brothers and sisters, all are welcome here at the Confessions podcast, whether saint or sinner.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Confessions podcast from the BBC, particularly the Radio 2 department. A little bit folksy, I think, that introduction.
Really?
I think it was all right.
Oh, it was very good.
Is that okay?
Very professional. Well
Anyway,
done.
so it's another Confessions podcast from Radio 2. Matt and Bobby are here just to adjudicate and just to reconsider whether they've been slightly too forgiving in some cases. Anyway, this week's collection of tales features the nightmare student from Birmingham's confession, I Put a Spell on You, Andy's tale, Running from Empties, Steve's misdemeanour, Take That to the Bank, and a confession we've excavated from the Confessions crypt as requested by Natalie and Norman and Shirley. But first, we start with Joseph's confession, which we called Danger Zone, which featured my fabulous array of accents.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And I can say that, I mean, you mock.
Yes, no, we do.
So here's the thing, there's a bunch of American accents coming up, and there are so many, I either decided just to ignore them completely and be very English about it, or to really go for it.
Go for it, yeah.
And Joseph, who sent in the confession, texted after we'd read it out.
Really?
And here's the text, Father Simon. I thought you did a great job on the accents in my confession tonight. It was like I was there again.
Right.
There you go. There you
It's
go.
a
From the
pity that we
man.
can't see sarcasm on a text, really, isn't it?
It's not sarcasm, it's accurate. As you're about to hear, here it comes.
yeah.
Simon Mayo's Confessions podcast. Please be seated.
Dear Father Simon and the congregation, this tale begins in November 1999 when two work colleagues and I were having a well-earned day off on a work trip to Fort Lauderdale, USA, following a 5-day conference. On the day in question, we'd spent part of the day on a helicopter ride as a special reward for our hard work, paid for by the company that we were working for at the time, which had nothing to do with anything aviation related, I should add. I was fortunate enough to have got the co-pilot seat, so I spent the entire flight chatting to the pilot and quizzing him about his helicopter, a Sikorsky S-92, if I remember correctly. After returning to the hotel, we decided to make the most of our last night before returning home, so we hit the local bars. Unlike myself, though, both John and David were young and unattached and were keen to see if any Fort Lauderdale ladies would be wooed by their quintessential English accents.
Hello.
You know how that works.
Oh yes, good evening. Hello. Not that I've ever done that on radio at all.
Okay, let's just fade Nigel out there. We headed off to the local piano bar, and while I went to get the drinks in, John and David went to scour the place for potential American friends. I'd just got served, and they both returned. Crikey, or words to that effect, said John. There's a load of girls in here. Big problem, though, said David. The place is rammed with Richard Gere types out of an officer and a gentleman. Now, as non-locals, we weren't to know that the aircraft carrier USS George Washington had recently come into port. But after a few sips of their beers, John and David decided shiny uniforms were no match for English accents and left me in peace while they went off to try their luck. I watched as they entered an adjacent room full of very attractive American women and, of course, about 400 very attractive US Navy officers. I didn't fancy their chances personally, but I was looking forward to watching them try. Before I knew it, they were both engaged in talking to a group of 3 naval officers and 3 local women. They'd been talking to the small group for about 15 minutes when John turned round and pointed right at me. I just waved out of politeness, but I began to feel a little bit nervous as they all kept looking at me. Eventually, 2 of the officers started walking towards me. Hey, let me buy you a drink, says one of them. What?
It's the action.
There's so many Americans in this.
Good.
They're all going to have exactly the same voice.
Really? Hot diggity dog. Yeah.
While he went to the bar, the other officer joined me, pulled up a stool and said, So, you fly them copters?
I do fly them copters.
My big match.
Before I could answer, his colleague reappeared with my beer and added, Hey, your friend, you've flown many...
What's this Mexican? Go on.
Your friend told us you've flown many sorties during the Gulf War. And that you're here test flying the new Sikorsky S-92 helicopter for the RAF. Is that right?
Oops.
I didn't know what to say. looked towards my so-called friends who were now seizing their opportunity and were fully engaged in their own conversations with the 3 American women, now liberated of their American friends. Well, I said, becoming all Hugh Granty, I don't really like talking about it. Strictly speaking, that wasn't a lie. Ah, no, of course not. Gee, no, the other, says the other officer. This is a completely other. Just then, the other officer who'd been with David and John appeared with an older, and very distinguished gentleman with more medals across his chest than I could count. Can I introduce you to the commanding officer of the aircraft carrier USS George Washington? Wow. One of them said. The commanding officer held out his hand and said, "It's a great pleasure to meet a distinguished Brit veteran. Tell me, is it true you're test flying the Sikorsky S-92 over here?" I nearly did a Basil Fawlty and pretended to faint on the spot because I could think of no way of getting out of this. But instead I started telling him about how nimble I thought the Sikorsky had handled today and that it was faster than I had expected. "A pretty neat piece of kit," I said. And then thinking back to what the pilot had told me during our trip during the day, I added, "I'd say it's a lot quicker than the S-70, that's for sure." Captain of the USS George Washington and his commanding officer nodded in agreement. Then the captain says, "We're thinking about changing from the MH-60S Seahawk helicopter on the carrier, and the Sikorsky's been mentioned. Let me introduce you to someone else." Oh no, not another voice. A less friendly looking, that's a stage direction, that is. Suddenly appeared, and more introductions compounding the earlier lie ensued. After an uncomfortably strong handshake from the Air Wing commander, he says,
Has he got the stutter?
just trying to...
Here he comes again. Come on, everyone.
So he says, "So..."
Oh!
That's too friendly. "So, do you like the Sikorsky?
What's this?
Tell me,
Sean Connery?
That's Deputy Dog. It is Deputy Dog.
do you like this Sikorsky?" "Sure," I said, my voice getting unrealistically high.
Yeah.
Sticking to my story. "It's not everything I'd like in a chopper," I said, "but it's quicker than the S-70. He nodded. I thought I'd gotten away with it, but then he added, "That's good, but what about its downward thrust dissipation? Would it be suitable for an aircraft carrier?" "Well, perhaps," I replied. "However, can I just ask you just to hold that question a minute, sir? I'm afraid I have to go to the washroom." Damn shrapnel and all that. I knew then that I had... Second World War reference.
Obviously.
I had to get out, and it could only get worse if I stayed around. As I headed for the washrooms, I grabbed David and John rather violently, has to be said. "You two, we're getting out of here," I shouted as we veered towards the exit and ran all the way back to the hotel. To this day, I still don't know how we managed to get out of that piano bar, or even Florida, without being killed for impersonating distinguished officers of the RAF. And so, Father Simon, I need forgiveness, not from the impressive Navy officers who hampered our attempts at chatting up American women, especially as technically I think the only lie I told was that I needed the bathroom. Instead, I would like to ask for your forgiveness on behalf of my shameless friends who to this day show no remorse for telling the American Navy that I was a top helicopter pilot just so that they could try and impress the ladies of Fort Lauderdale. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you. A vast cast there. I mean, it was.
Well,
if you close your eyes, there was
almost in Fort Lauderdale.
Of all ages and ranks.
all ages, ranks, from
Nationalities.
different states.
Yeah.
It was quite
It's a big,
extraordinary.
it's a big country.
Sorry about that. Anyway, Sister Bobby.
Oh, it's a close one, Joseph. But actually, it was David and John that set it up.
Absolutely.
And you kind of got landed in it, and it's really, really tricky in those situations because you don't obviously want to let your mates down either. So it's a difficult one. The thing is, and where I think I might forgive you, is you got out just where it got critical because you can't advise those Americans.
Well, he was advising the captain of the USS George Washington that the Sikorsky
he was basically
better.
given his he was giving his impression, wasn't he? But he wasn't really saying you should only get this helicopter, was he? He wasn't kind of walking down that dangerous road. He was saying, yeah, you know, I liked it, but he wasn't guaranteeing that this was the best thing for it. So I think, Joseph, you just about got away with it and you bailed out just in time, but only just for me to forgive you.
Novice, what do you make of that?
Yes, I don't think he actually said, yes, it's perfect for the USS George Washington, you know, with the thrust and
He
all
said
that.
it's quicker than the S-70.
Yeah, which is true.
But it's
Which
true.
another guy told him, absolutely. No, poor old Joseph. That was one of those where you think, oh my Lord, you absolutely landed in it. And I think he took the only sensible option, which was run! And he did, and fast, and grabbed his mates. So, Joseph, you got out of that well, and to this day, he must have thinking, limeys, Forgiven, completely forgiven.
Brother Matthew.
Oh, he's definitely forgiven. Joseph does very well, and you've got to hope that the US Navy is going slightly more in detail when it's doing its aircraft procurement, rather than just going up to some bloke in the bar and saying, is it better than that one? Yes, it is. Right, we'll go with that then. He's got more downward thrust dissipation. Seen them live. So I am going to say forgiven, obviously.
The Confessions Podcast.
Dear Simon, and those that have the power to grant a clear conscience to those that have deviated slightly from a path of goodness.
That's us.
I wish to ask for forgiveness for a small but rather wicked act that, in my defence, I carried out whilst rather bored as a pre-teenager. I was with my mother one hot, sunny afternoon during some school holidays down Preston Way. And being too young to be left at home, I'd been dragged around the shops. We'd queued to buy groceries. I'd waited for a long time in the opticians, and there'd be dry cleaning to collect as well. My mother is particularly friendly, so this trip with the bank as the last stop seemed to go on forever. She would stop to chat to everyone that she knew, and even a couple of people that she didn't. So finally, when we get to the bank, in these times, banks were much simpler, I should explain. For 99% of things, you needed to queue to see a cashier, and the queues could be very, very long. This particular branch was old and dated, and very much in need of a refurbishment, with dirty green linoleum tiles on the floor, and the walls painted a light brown. And unlike today's modern banks, this particular branch had no offices, and all of the staff, including the large elderly bank manager and bags of cash, could be viewed working away behind the cashiers. It's almost the bank from Mary Poppins, but not quite.
Wow.
Because that was super old.
Yes, it was.
Now, and then you go fly a kite when everything's fine.
Correct,
now,
yeah.
and you just need tuppence.
Yes, a bag.
For paper and string.
Feed the birds. Yep.
Or if you invest it wisely.
Oh, yes.
Somewhere in the bank.
Let's just do this.
Let's just burst into song any minute. Now, your younger listeners might not know that back then everything was done on a form. To deposit money, a customer would take a form and fill in one side, indicating the breakdown, the sum of the cash, all the numbers that you could possibly think of, and then hand it over. The customer would pass the form and the cash under a glass screen with speaking holes in it to the cashier, who was entirely shielded from the customer. And apparently with the press of a button, the cashier could very quickly raise a steel bulletproof barrier from the counter in front of them. An ominous reference, I think, so halfway through a confession.
Yeah.
But that's true. It wasn't so long ago that was the way every bank looked. After what seemed like hours of queuing, I was rather bored, says Steve. And to be honest, I'm not great when I'm bored. My mind wanders and I find myself things to do. And on this particular occasion, I started writing on the back of one of the forms. But after about 30 seconds, I was interrupted when Mum called me over to the window, and I hurriedly put the form back amongst the other blank ones and forgot all about it. It was only a month later, when I came across a copy of our local newspaper, that I even remembered that I'd been in the bank at all. So I read the headline on page 4. A chill went through me as I realised the monumental consequences of my childhood scribbling, which was, well, the headline is, Fake Hold-Up Note Panics Bank Staff. The story went on to describe how an old man had presented a cashier in the bank with a note that said, "This is a hold-up, be quiet, say nothing, empty your till of cash and pass it to me."
Oh, no.
I have to confess that this was actually my doing. But I was bored. But in my head, I imagined that, it'd be a laugh, really, and the customer and the cashier would have when they discovered the scribbled writing, and no one would really take it seriously. And it turned out in real life that the female cashier had tried to query it, but because the man was hard of hearing, he couldn't quite understand what she was saying. The cashier ended up by pressing the panic button. The alarm started ringing, the steel shutters went up, and the police arrived within 60 seconds. The queue of customers panicked, the bank staff went into a bank hold-up routine and locked themselves somewhere safe, and worst of all, the poor old man was actually arrested and escorted away in a confused state. Eventually, it became apparent that the poor man obviously knew nothing about the scribbled demand on the back of the form. He only wanted to take out £10.
Poor man.
Not £100,000. Just a tenner is fine. Couple of fivers. I'll take it in 2 shilling notes. No, 2 shilling coins.
Yeah. Yeah, those. Was it that long ago? Don't think so.
Threepenny bits is fine.
Yeah.
Order was restored and the poor gentleman was released, confused and probably more than a little bit angry. So I need forgiveness for causing distress to the old man, the cashier and the bank staff, also for wasting police time. and upsetting the queue of customers in the bank at the time. That said, I would like to think that it was a useful practice for the police and the bank staff. It should also be taken into account I was generally a very well-behaved young man and had never been in trouble in any way before setting up this old man who got carted off to the Nick when he just wanted some money out of his account. So, interesting. Not many banking confessions make it through, but let's see what Sister Bobby makes of this.
Well, Steve from Preston. It's tricky, isn't it? Because you had absolutely no idea and no intention of the consequences, although they were absolutely massive.
Writing a note is relatively harmless, you would think.
Well, the thing is, I was quite impressed with all you remembered. I would remember this as a hold-up and then forget. All the rest of it was quite detailed. So I'm quite interested to how you kind of remembered that. So I wouldn't have remembered all that, would you?
No.
Everything, don't say whatever. But I do think, actually, the consequences were completely out of your control, out of your intention completely, and it was a complete accident. However, the error of your ways, there's a lesson to be learned. There are places you don't muck around, and that's airports and banks, obviously.
Yes, that's
there is no joking there.
No.
So actually, Steve, it's actually really easy to give you a clear conscience. For your slight deviation, you are forgiven this time.
Yeah, I would think you're quite right. Customs you don't muck about. In banks you don't muck about. But this is so the little boy wrote a little note.
I mean, it's worth saying, Steve was pretty young at this time, and, we've all been young and foolish and done things that are a little bit silly and ill thought out. And so who are we to stand in judgment?
You're the confessional collective.
Well, that's exactly what we are, and so we are going to stand in judgment. But I am going to forgive here because I'm A, in that kind of mood, and B, idle hands, devil's work and all of that. So, lesson for us all. Surely there are 3 sentences that didn't seem to go anywhere. Anyway, I'm going to forgive.
Simon Mayo's Confessions Podcast.
Still to come, find out what on earth Matt is talking about here.
I would need quite a lot of very strong alcohol to get me through that.
Pretty much anything, really. It could be his journey home. It might be talking to my family. It might be coming into work. I mean, who knows what it's going to be.
Watching Chelsea?
Yes.
Anyway, before we head back to the confessional booth, there's a couple of new bits and pieces on the parish notice board. Here are some of the confessions that didn't make it through.
Oh, this is my favourite bit.
Because our producer is red hot on this. He knows what the rules are. Mm-hmm. And if he thinks the rules are broken, it doesn't get on. So we didn't include the confession about the man recovering from brain surgery who tore his remaining hair out to terrify some local children.
What made you think that was getting on?
That sounds quite
It's
good.
Halloween.
I quite like that one.
No. Tearing his own hair.
Horatio from Poplar's Tale about a can of deodorant, a lighter, and your dorm mate's eyebrow that is not big and is not
Obviously
clever.
not.
We also don't condone having Bacardis on your Year 8 school trip and being ill over your teacher's balcony. Helen, thanks very much. That's not making it on. A tale about the private country school, bored pupils, a classroom window, some local wildlife, and a shotgun isn't even slightly appropriate,
No.
Jenny. What are you thinking?
These are very good.
And we also don't condone, finally, Alan and friends who lit fireworks underneath an ice cream van with the ice cream man still inside. Now,
That's
this,
a big no.
that is such a big no. I'm surprised it even made it onto this podcast.
Yes,
Always
quite
go to a
right.
display, everybody.
So if your confession is going to be like that, then the chances are it's not going to get on.
But it will get read out in this bit. So,
Yeah,
swings
I
and
suppose
roundabouts.
that's true.
Can you share these with us fully?
I'll circulate them.
Yeah, all right.
Ben has said, this is from Facebook. Ben says, could you include, or it might be a tweet actually, could you include the lawnmower death confession
Oh, yes.
in a future podcast?
Yes.
It was the first confession I heard on drive time. He also had a tweet from Lawnmower Death yesterday, actually, from Lawnmower Death Pete,
Yes.
who liked the fact that we were talking about him. Anyway, so it's all right, Pete. So maybe we should include that. Maybe next week. Scott says, thanks to your Drive Time Confessions podcast, darker than a goth wardrobe is my new favourite metaphor. Peter on Facebook, Confessions, there should be a slot on BBC One because all these deserve a wider audience. Peter, let me tell you, there was a slot on BBC One for 4 years, and it was good fun, and then it stopped. So back in the day, it was all perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone who's been rating us, because wherever you get that podcast, like it might be iTunes, for example.
For example, or iTunes.
We're number 5 on the iTunes podcast, actually, and some of the reviews have been quite revealing as to where and when you listen to the podcast. Cycling, commute, drifting off to sleep. in the shower. I wouldn't think drifting off to sleep with much use.
In the shower?
Anyway, Dave presses play when he walks the dog. Ali saves it for the end of a morning run. And Tom says, question, when in the day do people choose to listen to Simon Mayo's Confessions podcast? The answer, different times.
Different times.
Any time, but different
times.
times, obviously. The late night podcast is kind of getting a lot of traction, but I don't think it's going to happen. Lee says we have to do one. Hannah says, I'd really love an after hours podcast of Confessions. Andy says, you have to do a late night Confessions podcast. We don't have to. It's the simple answer. Right. Do you have your 2-for-1 dictionary handy? Here is Nightmare Student from Birmingham's confession. I put a spell on you. Dear Father Simon, Drive Time Collective. As a child, it's fair to say that I was a swot. I love words, I adored English, and I usually got top marks in my class. Check me out. I also had the most irritating, grating habit that any teacher could dream up in their nightmares. I corrected their spelling. Publicly.
Yes.
My partner in crime was a Collins Pocket English Dictionary, and every time I thought they were wrong, and they usually were, at least 2 or 3 times a week, I would surreptitiously flick through it to confirm, and then up my hand would go like a shot. Of course, I assumed that the teachers were grateful for my help, as obviously they didn't want to teach the children wrong spellings. They were bad enough at spelling as it was. Plus, the other children seemed very happy when I put my hand up, and even made sure that when it did go up, the teacher knew about it. In this instance, I was 9 years old, and we were learning about prefixes, specifically the prefix in, and how it could reverse a word's meaning, constant and inconstant, flexible and inflexible, and so on and so forth. Until Mr. Smith got to flammable and inflammable. I got suspicious, and just to check, I snuck my little dictionary out to compare the meanings of the 2 words. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite subtle enough, and Mr. Smith noticed my flicking. All right then, Jane, he says loudly.
Right.
What does it say for flammable in the dictionary then? I'm sorry, sir, I just wanted to check. I can put it away. I trailed off, caving in the face of his confidence and not wanting to make a fuss. No, it's fine. Look it up. What does it say for flammable then? I was glad to get his approval. It says, that can catch fire and burn easily, sir. And what does it say for inflammable? I flicked through the few pages. It says exactly the same thing, sir. I answered hesitantly. What? The smile left his face. The cheekiness all gone. Well, the dictionary must be wrong. Get one of the big dictionaries at the back. Not you, sit down. So I sat down. Robert, you look it up, said Mr. Smith, who was a bit of an East Ender.
Yeah.
When under pressure.
Okay.
As so many teachers.
It turns out all of them are. Yeah, go on.
So flick, flick, flick went Robert in the big classroom dictionary. Different times. She's right, sir, Robert says with a grin. I can check another one if you like. Show me that, says Mr. Smith. He's another shouty teacher.
There's another one now.
And then he stomped across the room and took the dictionary. He stared at it for a few minutes and then put the dictionary back and walked out of the room in a strop. All the other students seemed very happy for some reason. I couldn't figure out why. I was only trying to be helpful. I was sure he'd gone to get another dictionary to confirm what the definition of inflammable was. I mean, you would have thought a teacher would have known that inflammable also means the same as flammable, but there you go. 20 minutes later, Mr. Smith came back. Mrs. Jones and I have been talking about it, and the opposite of flammable is non-flammable. Or maybe anti-flammable. We move on. We ignore it.
We ignore it.
Yes, that's what we do.
Move on, nothing to see.
So we carried on with the lesson, and soon it was time for lunch. I tucked my little dictionary in my desk, and I went out to eat and play. Tragedy struck an hour later. As I went back, I found my dictionary had mysteriously gone missing. Mr. Smith was very kind, though, and let me search for it during the afternoon break. We looked on the bookshelves, under the tables. I even emptied my desk completely, twice. And yet we were unsuccessful, even though the only place we didn't look was inside the teacher's desk. 9-year-old me trudged home that day, missing her faithful little dictionary, but reassured by Mr. Smith's promise to look for it after school. Come the next day, Mr. Smith was kind enough to tell me straight away that he had looked for many hours, but he couldn't find my dictionary. But luckily, I'm super clever and very helpful, and I'm prepared. It's all right, sir, I said to him, reaching into my bag and pulled out another Collins Pocket English Dictionary. Identical to the first one. When my mum bought me the other one, there was a 2-for-1 offer. So she got 2 of the same.
Who's buying 2? Who's buying 2 dictionaries?
Nightmare Student's mum.
Maybe she's got 2 children.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, fair enough.
Oh, was all Mr. Smith could say in reply. And after lunch that day, my old little dictionary magically was... You're not going to believe this, I know, but my old little dictionary magically reappeared on my desk, right where I'd left it the day before. Silly me. I must have missed it when I emptied my desk. Twice. I looked at Mr. Smith. To my young eyes, he seemed older, paler, and haunted by despair.
Really? To your 9-year-old eyes? Really?
Maybe I had wrecked his career by turning him into a bad 'un. My clever clog's attitude had worn him down to his core. I turned him into a felon. He took 3 days off, and for the rest of the term, he was a shadow of his former self.
Yes, that's right.
Our teaching standards dropped noticeably. I feel as though I am in some way to blame. So I seek forgiveness, not from the other children, who were very pleased with me because I got the teacher to stomp off in anger. Nor now do I think about it, do I need forgiveness from Mr. Smith, who was a teacher. He should have been a better speller. I also don't seek forgiveness from Mrs. Jones, who presumably spent 20 minutes calming Mr. Smith down because I had her the year before, and she was a terrible speller too. We're getting the measure of you now, nightmare student from Birmingham. I do seek forgiveness, however, from Mr. Smith's girlfriend, who I never met, but apparently was the one who had to listen to Mr. Smith rant about the one child who was possessed by the demon of Dictionary Corner. The last I heard, sadly, they weren't together, and Mr. Smith...
Not relevant.
Mr. Smith was never quite the same.
Oh, really? Right.
Well, you have to say Mr. Smith comes out of this very badly, doesn't he? Because it does appear as though he went into her desk and nicked her dictionary. But then, flammable and inflammable. That's quite famously mean the same thing. Anyway, let's check in with Sister Bobby here.
Great story. I'm really impressed at the fact that you carried a little dictionary around with you and you checked. And I can imagine some teachers' annoyance, but I think generally any good teacher will look at it as an opportunity.
Well, we'll welcome public correction.
It's not so much public. Well, I'm sure they're... Listen, if you're getting it wrong, you need to know. And also, each one teach one. It doesn't matter which way round it comes. That's what I think. 5-year-olds teach me stuff. It doesn't have to be... You don't have to be always the teacher, do you?
I reckon Mr. Smith, every time Nightmare Student from Birmingham's hand went up, a little part of him died.
Well, it's a chance for us all to be better. That's what he was lacking. I think Mr. Smith is definitely lacking. And as for forgiveness for the girlfriend, well, it seems like the girlfriend got off lightly and got away. So there you go. I think you're all right.
Yeah, because you don't want to be married to a bad speller.
No.
Imagine the horror.
It's not that. It's the attitude towards it. I can't spell very well.
Brother Matthew.
Well, I am going to say this is a classic case of a confession where it would be very interesting to hear the other side. And I think Mr. Smith knew full well that flammable and inflammable mean the same thing. What he was a teaching aid. What he was doing is he was thinking, how am I going to make this lesson stand out for my students so that they'll definitely remember this when they go home, and indeed in years to come. And he came across, I've got this girl in my class who constantly wants to check things out in the dictionary, so I'll get her involved, and the entire class will therefore remember that flammable and inflammable mean the same thing. And so he does all of this, and then there's a whole little thing with the dictionary being hidden and stuff like that. Quite a lot of assumptions being made about Mr. Smith having done that with the dictionary. So I'm going to say not forgiven.
This is the place where penitents seek our pardon for their sins. Simon Mayo's Confessions Podcast.
Father Simon and the Forum of Forgiveness. Can I just say before we continue that there is reprehensible behaviour in this particular story, which is not condoned. I'm just saying.
This sounds good.
No. I'm just.
Yeah.
It's not particular. It's not outrageously reprehensible.
How
but
did this gets past the lawyers?
I went to school at an inner city comprehensive in the northwest of England, where the only form of extracurricular activity came in the way of weekend camping trips for senior pupils, organised by our head teacher, Mr. Barker. The format for these weekends was always the same. 14 seniors and the head would pile into the school minibus and set off for the site with accompanying staff following along in their own cars. This always included the woodwork teacher, who towed a dinghy behind his car so he could spend the weekend sailing it.
Good for him.
Classic woodwork behaviour. Yeah. Now, our school being an inner city comprehensive, a lot of the pupils didn't fancy the idea of camping, so it turned out that the same old faces kept turning up. A favourite venue of Mr. Barker's was a field in Snowdonia, with a stream running down one side where we could wash, and also canoe, and a lake at the end where we could sail in the woodwork teacher's beloved dinghy. Now, it has to be said that there was some serious tent inequality in this particular camp. The rest of the party had two-man ridge tents, but Mr. Barker's abode for the weekend was a huge frame tent known to us regulars as Buckingham Palace. Here Mr. Barker spent the weekend with his entire family, who followed on by car and consisted of his wife, son, daughter, and his psychotic dog, Fido. After the journey, I think these trips sound quite fun, apart from the washing in the river bit.
Yeah.
After the journey, tent pitch and meal on Friday. An early night was called for, but on the previous Saturday nights during these weekends, it was something different. We would be fed our evening meal. Then, if the weather was good, the staff would build a bonfire for the children and retire to the large meal tent whilst we sat unsupervised round the roaring blaze. Someone would check on us at various intervals, but this became less frequent as the night wore on, and we would eventually be told to go to bed. Next morning, the contents of the camp rubbish bin would give mute testament to our lack of supervision. Lots of tins and bottles with labels which included the words % proof on them. Okay.
Yeah.
After a fairly humdrum day of activities on this particular Saturday, the evening came round and bang to form, the staff retired to their meal tent. Mr. Barker and his family were in Buckingham Palace, lording it up as usual, and we were happily sitting unsupervised round the blazing fire. Out came our special lemonades, and a good night was in the offing. Now, obviously, there's lots of reprehensible behaviour here.
Obviously. Obviously, we don't condone that. No.
Now, to make sure that we weren't discovered, we'd arranged a simple system. If the flap of the teacher's meal tent or Buckingham Palace so much as twitched, our spotter would simply burst into song, giving us time to hide the contraband. Our infrequent checks were accompanied by such campfire favourites as Row, Row, Row Your Boat, Kumbaya, My Lord, and rather appropriately 10 green bottles.
Oh, very good.
This system worked very well on the night in question until later in the evening, when a flap twitch resulted in a rousing chorus of Old MacDonald Had a Farm, and a shadowy figure approached the bonfire. People rushed to hide the illicit beverages, and then, as the figure got closer, we realised that it was, in actual fact, Mr. Barker's daughter.
Oh, aye.
Yeah.
Hello.
Who's the same age as us.
She wants to sing as well.
What are you up to? She asked. We're just sitting and having a sing, said one of our number, trying desperately to hide the can of pale ale that he'd been quaffing. That's beer, she exclaimed, because she's pretty smart. We hold our breaths. Was she about to reveal our ghastly secret to her dad? We waited. We waited a few more seconds, and then she said, "Can I have one?" So, phew, a tin was hesitantly passed over. "Thanks," she said, sitting down on a log. "Now, what are you really up to?" It must be said that the rest of the evening passed very convivially, and when time was called, we all went to bed very relieved that our secret had been kept. Of course, next morning the camp bin was overflowing with the results of our evening, something none of us had thought to address at the time. In the cold light of morning, I realised we had a problem. Surely there was no way Mr. Barker would miss this pile of cans and bottles. Well, he didn't. And Mr. Barker didn't hesitate to reprimand the guilty party over the contents, or who he believed to be the guilty party, because it turns out that the teachers had also had something of a night of it in the meal tent, and after our breakfast we could hear Mr. Barker giving them a thorough talking to over their consumption of lemonade from the night before.
Quite right.
Well, it turns out that they were at a loss to explain the sheer volume that had been consumed. The only reason they could think of was the fact that we were sharing the field with another set of campers, a party of RAF cadets, who must have used, obviously, they must have used our bin to dispose of their own evidence.
Makes sense
You
to me.
can't trust them RAFs.
Yeah.
So anyway, Father Simon, I need forgiveness from those members of staff who had such a hard time from the head over their perceived level of alcohol consumption, from the RAF cadets who were blamed, even without knowing it, for the problem, and from the head himself for leading his perfect daughter astray. I must say that now I work with young children, I'm regularly checked and would not condone this behaviour at all, but as we say, different times,
Yes.
now would seem an appropriate time to say different times. That is Andy's defence, really. And obviously now that kind of thing wouldn't happen because teachers are far more astute and clever and smart and on
Quite
the case,
right,
and
yes.
and also teachers don't drink anymore
That's also true.
At all.
at all, ever.
Yeah.
No.
Particularly if they're on school trips, because they need to set an example. And as for the head, well, so Sister Bobby, what do you think?
It's tricky. This is such an idyllic, lovely camping trip. I think you are very, very, very lucky children to have teachers that want to take you camping, because you can imagine they might want a break from you. But no, they took you with them, which is really, really lovely. And also left you to your own devices, so you had some time on your own, which is great. Generally, I think there was no harm done generally, and it seems that you were actually quite well, behaved with what you were drinking with the lemonade. It wasn't kind of too much. You kind of kept it, you know, that's... I think really I'm going to have to forgive, because it seems that no harm's done at all. So it's a quite easy forgiver.
All right, Brother Matthew.
I have to say, if someone told me that I was going to have to wash myself in a stream for a week, I would need quite a lot of very strong alcohol to get me through that.
But not when you were at school.
Not obviously when I was at school. That said, I mean, where were the showers? There was no showers at all. I'm going to have to go in the river? That makes no sense.
They didn't have showers in those
obviously,
days.
back in those days, different times. So I am minded to forgive, because, you know, there's only one way of getting through that, particularly with a psychotic dog running around as well.
Yes.
I'm definitely going to forgive.
Simon Mayo's Confessions podcast.
Well, they were this week's confessions. If that has inspired something, let us know your own shadowy secret, perhaps inspired by one of those confessions at bbc.co.uk. So we are including a classic confession every single week, and you can ask for them, and if we can find them, we'll put it in. Norman Kelly says, loving the new Confessions podcast. If I could hear one from the past, it would be when the woman gets herself stuck in the cat flap after a night out and she can't find her keys.
This is superb.
Shirley Soda. Never. And she's in Chicago as well. Hi, I'm Shirley Soda.
Is there no end?
I'm so encouraged.
Is there no end to his
I'd love to hear the
accents?
confession by the lady who got stuck in the cat flap door of her house after an evening out with her friends. It's one of my favourites.
Yeah.
Listen all the time in Chicago. And Natalie in Glasgow, I've always really enjoyed the Confessions feature on your show, and although I never tweet because I don't have Twitter, obviously, I regularly listen to the podcast. When you asked for suggestions, I immediately thought of the one that had me crying with laughter. I actually had to move away from my desk where I was studying for my hires because I was laughing so much. The details I remember, it was written by a female. She'd gone out with her keys, returned slightly drunk, and she got her head stuck in a cat flap. I hope you read this email and you like my suggestion. Natalie, as you can tell, a lot of people are waiting for precisely this confession.
The Confessions podcast.
Dear Father Simon and the Forgiving Few, I just want to start by saying I love your show, listen to it every day, and I love the confession slot.
Brilliant.
Right, well, forgiven then. I write to ask forgiveness from you beautiful people for a sad episode that happened back in 1999 when I was 24. It all started after a very rowdy night out at a friend's hen party in Chester. It ended up by being a very late night. I got home after 4 a.m. Taxi dropped me off. At the time, I lived alone in a lovely semi-detached house in an equally lovely and quiet cul-de-sac in North Wales. I had 2 cats, Chubby and Charlie. Real names, haven't changed those. I tried to locate my front keys after I'd been dropped off in my little handbag, but I couldn't find them anywhere. I was effectively locked out of my house. Now, the last time I managed to lock myself out, I got into the back garden, I knelt down and I put a small broomstick through the cat flap and knocked the back key door out of the lock. I put my hand through the cat flap and got the key. That's how I did it last time. So on this fateful night, or early morning as it was, I thought I could do the same. My first obstacle was the back gate, which I'd forgotten I had locked earlier the previous day. So I climbed and stumbled onto the bonnet of my first ever company car in my high heels, launched myself over the gate into the back garden. Luckily, I landed on the soft lawn and was relieved I was alone, as my short skirt had ended up revealing a little bit too much that was decent. This is a relevant point, by the way. I then found my small broom and went about to trying to get my little trick going in dislodging the back door key through the cat flap. Well, for some reason, I couldn't seem to keep the broom straight whilst reaching through the cat flap, and I couldn't remember if I'd even left the back door key in the lock in the first place. So I thought it'd be a good idea if I could just see if the key was in the lock. So I had a tipsy brainwave to put my head into the cat flap, which seemed more than big enough, frankly, to accommodate my head. And then if I could just see the key was in the lock, then I could carry on with my attempt to knock it out of the lock. But it didn't quite go according to plan. I knelt down and proceeded to put my head through the cat flap quite easily, whilst giggling to myself and thinking, I'm so glad that no one can see what I'm doing. To my delight, the key was in the back door lock, which was a relief. So I then went to remove my head back out of the cat flap, and Guess what? My ears seemed to have got stuck, so I could not get my head back out. I tried again by planting my hands firmly on the cold concrete and tried and pushed and heaved, but to no avail. So as you can imagine, I started to sober up pretty quickly and started to panic. Now, I live alone, so I couldn't shout for anyone to come and help, and it was 4:30 in the morning, and my neighbour is elderly and deaf. So after trying and trying again to dislodge my head, I started shouting help as loud as I possibly could and praying and hoping that someone in my very quiet and well-to-do cul-de-sac would hear my frantic shouts. In the meantime, my cats had got very distressed and kept pushing my face from the inside to try and get out, much to my annoyance. After what seemed like a very long time, I heard someone climbing over my gate, and I just hoped it would be a friendly neighbour. But to my complete embarrassment and shock, it was the local policeman. Apparently one of the neighbours had called the police, hearing my shouting and a bit of a commotion. The policeman climbed over the fence without jumping on the bonnet of my car, which I had done. Now, you need to know I had a bench next to my back door, and all I could hear was a muffled noise which sounded to me like crying. The policeman had to literally sit down on my bench as he couldn't stop laughing. After shouting to him through the cat flap, he understood what I had done, so went into my handbag to double check my front door keys were actually lost. Would you believe it? They were there all the time. Oh, no. I was even more mortified at this point, as he must have thought I was even more stupid than I looked. So this young, and I have to say quite attractive policeman, led himself in through my front door, though I could say you wouldn't know this at the time. Anyway, led himself in through the front door, let my cats out, and came and sat on the floor in my kitchen to talk it all through with me and to find out how I'd got into this state. He really was very nice, considering what a fool I'd made of myself, and he tried to everything to coax my ears flat back against my head so I could get my head out of this wretched cat flap. He tried washing up liquid, he tried face cream from the bathroom, and even olive oil, but nothing was working. So he looked at me with a big smile on his face and said, "I'm going to have to call the fire brigade."
Hey!
So this policeman then called the local fire station and explained the situation, and I could tell he was trying so hard not to laugh, and I heard him say no, the full team did not have to come out, and explain the nature of the call. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, a fire engine roars up with lights flashing, filling the small cul-de-sac at 6 a.m. with the whole fire station who'd turned up, as they couldn't believe what the fireman had said. By this time I was mortified beyond anything you can possibly imagine. The kind, and again, just my luck, attractive fireman went into my bedroom and brought down a quilt to hide my modesty. My inadequate skirt was stressing them out, and they had to keep chatting to me to calm me down. Anyway, to be honest, they were all lovely, even though they were trying so hard to stifle their laughter. So next up came a large saw. The plan was to cut a larger hole in my wooden back door and then a smaller saw to dislodge the cat flap. So the saw started to work, with one fireman cutting a hole around me and the other fireman in the back garden holding the duvet discreetly around my waist. You can imagine this is a delicate operation. So all I can hear is this saw cutting into my beautiful back door, and it then got caught on something, maybe a knot in the wood. The saw jumps sideways and knocks the side of my head. Oh my. I saw stars, though I do think the alcohol helped numb the pain. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, the police decided they had to call an ambulance to attend. So it went from me being alone, drunk and stuck in a cat flap, to a police car and a fire engine and now an ambulance outside my house. The fireman managed to cut a hole in my back door, get me off my knees, but I was then carried into the waiting ambulance with a now bloody plastic cat flap. That's the cat flap that is bloody, still attached to my head. I was protesting that I was fine and didn't want to go to hospital, but they insisted. So again, just when you think it can't get any worse, I'm wheeled into my local A&E on a stretcher with a plastic cat flap around my neck, which was eventually removed by a bemused consultant at the hospital, who sent me home with a packet of paracetamol for my headache, which was caused more by my shame and a hangover. There are no words really to describe how embarrassing the whole experience has been, and all I wanted to do was to crawl into bed to hide under my duvet forever. But the policeman who originally responded to my call for help popped round to make sure I was okay. She adds euphemistically. Anyway, my back door was secured. So I'd like to seek forgiveness to all my unfortunate neighbours who were all woken up by my drunken shouts for help at 4 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning, and then having the street filled with all the emergency services in turn. Also forgiveness from my then employer when I told him I had no idea how 2 large scratches appeared on the bonnet of my new company car. And forgiveness to my cats, who will never understand why they will, the current cats that is, who will never understand why they will not get a cat flap fitted into the back door.
As you can imagine, I was the talk of my street for a very long time. I became known as the cat flap woman, and from that morning onwards, I put my house up for sale and I moved to another town. So I love your show and would love it if this was included in your show. So Heather, we've changed the name, though the names of the cats are genuine, tells us an interesting story, which you can understand, I think, how she was very, very embarrassed. It was just an innocent hen night and ended up A&E, all the emergency services. What do you say?
Bit extreme to sell her house, don't you think? I mean, the neighbours didn't see her in her...
Well, they did. Do
you think they did?
Yes.
Okay.
Unbelievably, I shortened the story.
Right,
Really?
okay.
Quite a lot.
Some lovely images came to mind during that, not least the cat flap around her neck as she was on the stretcher going to hospital. I just love that story. It's fantastic.
And the policeman arriving with this woman with her head through the door.
And trying to, rub olive oil on her ears and stuff. That's just great. It's worse than the toe in the tap, isn't it, when you get the stories about getting your toe caught in the tap during your bath time. I think, it's a great story, so I'm going to forgive.
What do you say, Brother Matt?
What a story that is. Absolutely superb. But I would say you've now ruined the emergency services for that story, because they live for that. They live for the one call that comes in of, we've got a young lady caught in a cat flap, care to come and get her out.
Yes, and the whole station.
Yes, there was I'll go. So they'll never get a call like that again, and they'll all have been regaling themselves with that story for a while. So I am definitely going to forgive. What a superb story.
The Confessions Podcast.
Our classic confession, the woman with her head in the cat flap.
Yes,
I
superb.
absolutely love that. And we had to take out a lot.
It's great, isn't it? Because also, you love all the emergency services so much more after that as well.
That's classic Bobby line, that is.
Yeah, well done.
Sister Bobby, you forgave everybody this week. 4 out of 4. You are definitely going soft.
Do you know what? I felt that this week. I really did think, hang on a second, I need to toughen up. Obviously, my summer break's been too long, and you're definitely too soft.
Well, Matt's just behind. He forgave the last 3. You didn't forgive I Put a Spell on You. That's the only one that you...
Oh, yes. Well, one has to have standards. Even a sewer rat like me needs to have standards, so,
If you made it to the end of the podcast last week, I asked you to tweet darker than a goth's wardrobe. So, loads of people were doing that all week. Hannah, Jones, Sergio and David and Alex and Neris and loads more people. Thank you very much indeed. This week's code phrase is... Let's go with... Broad beans is a main course. but it has to be done with a slight... sarcasm, irony, derision.
Does that come over on the Twitter?
I think maybe maybe there's an emoji that can do just that. Thank you very much, Steve, for downloading us. Don't forget, you can hear the whole radio show every week, because we do this live every weekday.
Imagine.
Every weekdays from 5 on BBC Radio 2. Bobby says goodbye.
Goodbye.
Matt says goodbye.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from... So long, y'all.
The Confessions Podcast. Go in peace.